Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Tuesday, 7 May 2024. It is the 313th anniversary of the birth of David Hume, who was born on Edinburgh on this date in 1711, although this date is a little ambiguous because Hume was born before the calendar changed, so his dates are given as old style and new style. So the date of 7 May is the new style date, and so when he was actually born, the calendar said 26 April. So it was retroactively changed. So Hume was born on the 7th of May, and Edward Gibbon was born on the 8th of May. Although they were a generation apart, you can consider today's episode on Hume as part one of Enlightenment historiography, and tomorrow's episode on Gibbon as part two of Enlightenment historiography, as I will be touching on many similar issues with regard to both Hume and Gibbon. Today, we think of Hume as a philosopher, first and foremost, and probably the most influential Anglophone philosopher of all time. It would be fair to say that Hume is the godfather of traditional Anglo-American analytical philosophy, or even more narrowly, the godfather of logical empiricism. In Hume, you can already find the origins of the is-ought distinction and the analytic-synthetic dichotomy as we currently understand them, and which have played such a prominent role in analytical philosophy, whether they are being defended or refuted. Hume also set the tone for empiricism in Anglophone philosophy. The fundamental ideas of empiricism were pioneered by Hume. They achieved their most explicit and uncompromising formulations in the work of the logical empiricists, and now we retain those ideas, but in a highly qualified and conditional form, having learned the limitations of empiricism from the doctrinaire expression of these years, of these ideas 100 years ago, when the logical empiricists were experiencing their apogee. It's often said that modern philosophy began with Descartes, and Descartes' work is sometimes characterized as an epistemological turn in philosophy. It wouldn't be saying too much to say that modern Anglophone philosophy began with Hume, and that Hume represented an empiricist turn in philosophy. All of this is to say that Hume dominates the philosophical tradition in English-speaking countries. But in his own time, Hume was a failure as a philosopher. He said that his first great philosophical work, A Treatise of Human Nature, which was originally published in 1739-1740, fell dead-born from the press. But Hume recovered from the disappointment and eventually made a name for himself as an historian. He continued to publish philosophical works, many of which were rewritten portions of the larger A Treatise of Human Nature, and some of which broke new ground, but still continued to develop Hume's empiricist and skeptical point of view. So Hume left his dialogues concerning natural religion to be published posthumously, probably because he anticipated that it would be controversial, but he published his work on miracles while he was still alive. Section 10 of Hume's 1748 book, An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, is titled Of Miracles, and it includes this, which I will repeat. Quote, "Upon the whole, then, it appears that no testimony of any kind of miracle has ever amounted to a probability, much less to a proof, and that even supposing it amounted to a proof, it would be opposed by another proof derived from the very nature of the fact which it would endeavor to establish. It is experience only which gives authority to human testimony, and it is the same experience which assures us the laws of nature. When, therefore, these two kinds of experience are contrary, we have nothing to do but subtract the one from the other and embrace an opinion either on one side or the other, with that assurance which arises from the remainder. But according to the principle here explained, this subtraction with regard to all popular religions amounts to an entire annihilation, and therefore we may establish it as a maxim that no human testimony can have such a force as to prove a miracle and make it a just foundation for any system of religion." Unquote. This isn't all of Hume's critique of miracles, but it gives you a flavor of his arguing and of his argument, and this argument has been very influential in subsequent philosophy, especially, as I implied earlier, in Anglophone analytical philosophy. If there are no miracles, and the kind of providential philosophy of history that we find in figures like St. Augustine and Bossuet must be false, and we must proceed by understanding history in terms of human motivations and human exertions, and we understand human beings by understanding human nature. Belief in a fixed human nature, universal human nature, and the rejection of miracles are mutually dependent theses in Hume's implicit philosophy of history. Hume's critique of miracles, along with some other ideas of Hume, was picked up a generation later by Edward Gibbon, who tells us the story of the Milvian Bridge without mentioning any supernaturalistic element in the story. Tradition has preserved for us the story that prior to the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine saw a vision of the cross, and next to it in Latin, in hoc signo vinces, by this sign thou shalt conquer. And then he had a dream in which Christ explained to him the significance of the vision. So Constantine had a military standard made that included what has come to be called the Chi Rho symbol, which are the first two letters of the name of Christ in Greek superimposed on each other. And his troops subsequently marched into battle carrying the Chi Rho symbol and the cross. So that has been an important, I'm pretty sure that story appears in Eusebius. I didn't look it up before making this episode. But that's been an important part of the story, but Gibbon just skates right over it and gives us a completely naturalistic account of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, which was one of the crucial episodes that brought Constantine the Great to power. Echoes of Hume on miracles can be found in the following passage from Gibbon. Quote, "The miracles of the primitive church, after obtaining the sanction of ages, have been lately attacked in a very free and ingenious inquiry, which, though it has met with the most favorable reception from the public, appears to have excited a general scandal among the divines of our own as well as other Protestant churches of Europe. Our different sentiments on this subject will be much less influenced by any particular arguments than by our habits of study and reflection, and above all, by the degree of evidence which we have accustomed ourselves to require for the proof of a miraculous event. The duty of an historian does not call upon him to interpose his private judgment in this nice and important controversy, but he ought not to dissemble the difficulty of adopting such a theory as may reconcile the interests of religion with that of reason, of making a proper application of that theory, and of defining with precision the limits of that happy period, except from error and from deceit, to which he might be disposed to extend the gift of supernatural powers. And from the first of the fathers to the last of the popes, a succession of bishops, of saints, of martyrs, and of miracles is continued without interruption. And the progress of superstition was so gradual and almost imperceptible that we know not in what particular link we should break the chain of tradition. Every age bears testimony to the wonderful events by which it was distinguished, and his testimony appears no less weighty and respectable than that of the preceding generation, till we are insensibly led to accuse our own inconsistency if on the 8th or in the 12th century we deny the Venerable Bede, or to the Holy Bertrand, or to the Holy Bernard, the same degree of confidence which in the 2nd century we had so liberally granted to Justin or to Irenaeus. If the truth of any of these miracles is appreciated by their apparent use and propriety, every age had unbelievers to convince, heretics to confute, and idolatrous nations to convert, and sufficient motives might always be produced to justify the interposition of heaven." Unquote. So that is from chapter 15, Progress of the Christian Religion, from Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. So he has assimilated Hume, but he, as always with Gibbon, he keeps a studied distance to Hume. He doesn't say, yes, Hume was right. He also doesn't say, yeah, no, Hume was wrong. He elaborates it, he discusses it, and he considers its relevance to the history he is writing. Like Kant and Machiavelli, both of whom I recently discussed, Hume didn't write any books on philosophy of history. Claudia M. Schmidt, in her book, David Hume, Reason in History, noted that, quote, "Hume does not provide us with a specific work concerning the philosophy or methodology of history," unquote. True. However, Schmidt does show us how Hume's history is bound up with his philosophy and vice versa. Quote, this is from Claudia Schmidt. In the treatise and the first inquiry, Hume introduces historical inquiry as a type of causal reasoning in which we judge the probability that an event has occurred in the past by reasoning from evidence that we encounter in the present. This evidence may be conveyed in whole or in part through oral reports extending back to the supposed witness of the event. However, in these cases, the historical facts are often disguised by every successive narration as a result of feeble memories, exaggeration, or even carelessness until the report contains little or no resemblance to the original event, unquote. Schmidt also recognizes the constitutive role that Hume's conception of human nature plays in his history. We recall that Hume called his first great work that fell dead-born from the press, A Treatise of Human Nature. So again from Schmidt, quote, Hume is seeking to account for the actions of historical individuals as effects of their passions and beliefs, characters, and circumstances. In so doing, he is applying the principle regarded by Sabine as a discovery of the 19th century that history is peopled by actual human beings with human desires and purposes, and the historian's task includes recreating the men and women of the past, entering into their feelings and desires, and explaining their actions to posterity, unquote. It would be interesting to take up that idea in comparison to Collingwood's idealistic philosophy of history, since I said earlier that Hume can be regarded as the origins of modern Anglophone philosophy, but we don't see an indigenous, as it were, philosophy of history in Anglophone philosophy until Collingwood in the 20th century. And this idea of recreating the men and women of the past, in Hume, is going to be interpreted in an empirical way. But Collingwood's idea is that we relive the thoughts of past actors in history, and so the same idea appears in a realistic way. Hume's own self-understanding of the role in history of human knowledge is given in a brief essay of the study of history, and this is from Hume, quote, history is not only a valuable part of knowledge, but opens the door to many other parts, and affords materials to most of the sciences. And indeed, if we consider the shortness of human life and our limited knowledge, even of what passes in our time, we must be sensible that it would be forever, we should be forever children in understanding, were it not for this invention, which extends our experience to all past ages and to the most distant nations, making them contribute as much to our improvement in wisdom as if they had actually been under our observation. A man acquainted with history may, in some respect, be said to have lived from the beginning of the world, and to have been making continual additions to his stock of knowledge in every century, unquote. There's a lot that could be said about that passage. Someone who has lived from the beginning of the world and who has continually added to their stock of knowledge throughout the ages might be regarded as a kind of thought experiment that we can perform. We can ask how much an individual might perceive history and human action historically, and Hume implies this is the perspective that history provides to us. But there are many kinds of history, and as I've described in many previous episodes, there are many ways to intellectually engage with the past. I've said that we have to map the conceptual space of history, which acknowledges that there are different conceptual areas of history. One might reasonably wonder whether the nature of our continual additions to our stock of knowledge shapes our understanding of the world that we grasp through the medium of history from its beginning. So far, Hume's empiricist history only seems to rule out miracles and therefore most providential philosophy of history. What positive feature would we expect to see from an empirical philosophy of history? In the passage I just quoted from Hume, some features are implied, and the quote from Claudia Schmidt implies an engagement with human nature, which we certainly find in Hume, as well as an interest in a quasi-scientific account of historical causality, with the fully human historical agent caught within a network of causal processes. Later in the Enlightenment, this approach came to be called philosophical history, with Gibbon being perhaps the most famous practitioner. We can find this kind of causal explanation of historical events in ancient history, especially in Thucydides, but this way of history was largely lost in the early Middle Ages, and the chronicle came to replace history as the primary form of historical record keeping. With the advent of modernity, the tradition of history as explaining historical causality had to be rediscovered, and Hume and Gibbon were part of this rediscovery. And this process continues to unfold up to the present day, as the logical distinctiveness of narrative propositions only came to be explicitly understood in the 20th century. Today, we take narrative explanatory history for granted. That is to say, we take philosophical history for granted. We don't even think of it as philosophical history. And we don't see it as an innovation, but it was a long, slow process to converge on history as we know it today, a process that co-evolved with the growth of historical consciousness that occurred in parallel with the growth in the sophistication of historical research and writing. And this process continues today as historical methodology and historical consciousness continue to grow in parallel, and each stimulates the other. So what can we expect from the tradition of philosophical history as it continues to develop? I said earlier that Hume was the godfather of logical empiricism. Can there be a logical empiricist philosophy of history that builds on the work of Hume? The only contribution to Otto Neurath's International Encyclopedia of Unified Science, which was in its day a logical empiricist organ, concerned with history was Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. In the work of Kuhn, we certainly find a philosophical history of a subtle and sophisticated order, but it seems to point in a direction other than that of logical empiricism. It is something of a fluke that Kuhn's work appeared in Neurath's series of logical empiricist monographs. Hume himself seems to point in a different direction, as I quoted him above, writing about continual additions to our stock of knowledge, which implies a cumulative conception of knowledge that Kuhn is usually presented as having shown to be untenable. Haskell Fane, in his book, Between Philosophy and History, calls this Hume's addition theory of knowledge, being, quote, the view that changing theories and ideas result in addition to, but not an alteration of mankind's conception of what knowledge itself is. Knowledge, like human nature, is judged everywhere the same, though methods for arriving at it change, unquote. That was Haskell Fane. On the one hand, this does seem to fit with the kind of universalism characteristic of the Enlightenment and which informs Hume's conception of human nature. On the other hand, Hume's passing remark about an additive conception of knowledge doesn't necessarily commit him to excluding the possibility that added knowledge alters earlier knowledge. In the 20th century, this view that added knowledge alters earlier knowledge has come to be commonplace in the form of narrative accounts of philosophy of history since Danto. And as we saw, this kind of narrativism wasn't made explicit until the 20th century, long after Hume's time. So we could say that it was implicit, the growth of this was implicit in Hume's work, but it didn't flourish until much later. Hume actually gives us very little to go on to elaborate a more comprehensive philosophy of history. So we are in essence grasping at straws with Hume, and Hume's historical writings do not seem to embody any obvious philosophical principles other than the exclusion of miracles and the miraculous. This has continued to be the case with the logical empiricists whose work built on Hume. The logical empiricists often, some of them explicitly said the only philosopher in the tradition that they respected was Hume. So it seems that the logical empiricists were as indebted to Descartes as to Hume, as they share the Cartesian indifference to history. Neurath himself, in one of his monographs included in the International Encyclopedia of Unified Science, gave something of a sketch of what a logical empiricist history might look like. Quote, all sciences as dovetailed to such a degree that we may regard them as parts of one science which deals with stars, Milky Way, Earth, planets, animals, human beings, forests, natural regions, tribes, and natures. In short, a comprehensive cosmic history, unquote. That's from Neurath's Foundations of the Social Science, which is #1, Volume 2 in the Unified Encyclopedia. But this is just the barest hint of what might be done with the intellectual resources of the whole tradition of empiricist and skeptical philosophy. It sounds a lot like contemporary big history, which I discussed in my episode on my paper, A Complexity Ladder for Big History. So there's that. Big history seems to fulfill the Humean conception of the function of history giving the individual a perspective as though he lived from the beginning of the world. On the other hand, a providential philosophy of history like we find in St. Augustine might also be said to give the individual perspective as though he had lived from the beginning of the world, though the providential world of St. Augustine is distinct from the scientific world of logical positivism. Here, the kind of knowledge that is cumulatively added through historical experience appears in stark relief in these two distinct contexts. Hume's exclusion of providential philosophies of history that invoke miracles excludes the kind of cumulative knowledge construction that we find in Augustine and those who followed him. Perhaps that is the lesson. An empiricist philosophy of history is and ought to be primarily defined in terms of what it excludes and less in terms of what it includes. Empiricism, then, is a principle of selection of history, and giving an account of the problem of selection has been one of the abiding problems of history. There's always more material, there's almost always more material than you can ever include. The historians of selection has been a point of contention because it is always a potential source of bias. An empirical philosophy of history holds the promise of providing a definitive answer to the selection problem. This would be a deflationary philosophy of history that would entirely do without the signs and wonders that inhabit the pages of more credulous historians of the past. We might believe ourselves to have long outgrown signs and wonders and think ourselves superior to the historians who once invoked them, but the human mind is not so easily demythologized. We have put aside supernatural miracles and we have replaced them with our own signs and wonders, which we can't see for what they are, precisely because we wholly inhabit the conceptual framework that justifies them, just as past historians wholly inhabited the conceptual framework in which signs and wonders were justified. So Hume's skepticism can still be a help that we need to extricate ourselves from our presuppositions and thus to carry forward the project of a deflationary philosophy of history. So happy birthday, David Hume, and thanks for listening.